I promised to say something about how I kept my spirits up, despite the fact that I had had a terrible accident and been handicapped for months since. In a way, it was a test of some of the things I said in one of my last videos, which was the one called I'm going to blow your mind. That video was about, it started with me pretending to rewrite great stories of the past. Rewrite them in such a way that not to please literary critics, but to please the characters in those stories. For example, Casino Royale, the James Bond story, in which James Bond has to go through a hell of a lot of, he's nearly killed and he ends up being tortured by the enemy before he finally triumphs. Now, in my version, I made him defeat the enemy in the very first chapter, make a lot of money and retire. James Bond loved it. But the point is that who would buy a James Bond novel where he defeats the enemy in the very first chapter? The only person who would buy it would be James Bond himself. You see, I was drawing a distinction between a good life and a great story. James Bond would have liked a good life, but he was actually written into a great story. And so the video, the subtext of it really was what makes a good life and what makes a good story. And maybe you would have to watch it more than once to really see that aspect of it. I'll give an example from my own life. In the Abramelin Diaries, my book about my experience of doing the Abramelin operation, I include a long section at the end about the turmoil in my life which followed for about 7 years after completing the operation, the 6 months operation. And one of the things that happened, and I explained, is that I was suffering disrespect from the authorities. This was a time of Margaret Thatcher being Prime Minister, and she had, as many politicians do, created scapegoats of people who are out of work. They were no longer people that needed help, we felt sorry for. People out of work were scroungers, they were a hindrance to the economy, they were to be despised. And I felt that as I stood in the offices, the Dole offices, applying for my grant. Typically there'd be a room full of people with long queues to get up to these desks where you would hand in your papers to be dealt with. And sometimes I might queue for sort of 20 minutes or half an hour to get to a desk, and the person just looked at my paper and said, wrong queue, next one please. And there'd be some little notice I was supposed to have read, infuriating. Real disrespect. I was so angry with this after several times that I decided, I thought, what can I do about this? These people are behind sort of bulletproof glass screens with just little slots for putting in your documents. And I decided the only thing I could think of would be to take in petrol, pour it under those screens and throw in a lighted match to blow up their office. So that's what I did. Next time I went there, I took a shopping bag with a gallon of petrol, matches, and a lighter. I'm a belt and braces sort of person. And but I made one pact with myself. You see, I was raging against disrespect, but I could only really justify that if I didn't show disrespect myself. In other words, what if amongst those horrible bureaucrats there were one or two decent ones? It would be a pity if I poured my petrol and burnt one of the few good bureaucrats who would have treated me with respect. So I decided that I would hand over my papers, look him in the eye, and give him every chance to treat me with respect. And he did. He was polite, courteous, efficient, and in no time he'd stamped my papers and I went on my way. And you know, I was so relieved. It was like a burden off my shoulders. I had been respected, my life improved, and I had been at rock bottom. And I realized that if I had gone through with that act, if I'd been disrespected and I had set fire to the office, I would have gone to prison. So my little piece of magic had given me a better life. But when I look back 40 years later as to what would have happened if I had burnt the office down, it's a very different story. You see, I would have gone to prison. I would have been headline news. I would have been interviewed by journalists. And being the sort of radical, angry young man I was, and still am in a small way, I would have, when I was in prison, I would have written a manifesto, a ranting rage about the system. Because after all, this is the time when I wrote and published Thundersqueak. I was in that sort of mood. And my prison sentence would probably be over, and I would now be a well-known writer, maybe selling many books, with publishers queuing up for my material. I would be famous and maybe even rich. You see, the world values a good story much more than a good life. How does that show? Well, my wife likes watching television, and I enjoy watching it with her. So typically we might spend 2 hours a day watching Netflix series and movies. We also read novels. We're in a book club. We read novels to each other, dramatic stories. We're enjoying good stories for 2 or 3 hours a day very often. Now, many people binge on Netflix even more than us, which means they might be spending 4 hours a day on good stories. That's about a quarter of their waking life. Enjoying good stories. Now, what makes these good stories? They're about corruption, evil politics, violence, destroying the environment, breakups in relationships. This is what makes good stories. For instance, one of the ones we really loved was called Line of Duty, about an anti-corruption unit in the UK police, London police force. It was really good. And it wasn't just sort of fun action violence, it was educational. For instance, in the first series, it attacked that idea that corruption is other people, bad people, versus good people. Because here was a story of a good cop, a person who got results. He was a great team leader. His team got good results, and they loved him and worked hard under him. And he was investigated by the anti-corruption department. They hated it. We're not like that. You bastards, what are you trying to put on us? But it turned out that he was not only a good cop, he was also a good family man. And bad people had put pressure on him through his daughter as a weak point. and that had led him to bend the rules, and so he became corrupt. You see, that's realistic. It's educational. How could you follow that in later editions? Well, of course, it turns out that corruption is higher and higher up in the police force. In the last episode, the last series we watched, it looked as though actually the head of the anti-corruption department was himself corrupt, part of the system. And this is exciting because this is what is happening in real life. In South Africa, we have really bad corruption. Corrupt politicians who have corrupted the basic anti-corruption forces like the legal system and the investigative services, so that they allow corruption to take place. So we're spending a lot of our time enjoying stories of corruption, bad politicians, stories of violence, wartime, and stories. I remember a wonderful one of environmental disaster and New York being swamped by a huge tsunami and things like that. So what do we can conclude? What do we learn from the thing I wrote? I said I would explain partly why I was not totally depressed by my run of bad luck. Well, I could look at it as a bad life, things going wrong, or I could look at it as a great story. Here I am being tormented by the demons that beset people who attempt the Abramelin operation. It's a great story. It's a way of looking at your own troubles, which helps to distance you slightly. One of the most miserable things that I've experienced, of course, is unrequited love. You fall madly in love with someone and they reject you. This is really painful. It's not a good life, but it is a great story. You're being invited to take part in one of the greatest stories of humankind. A story which inspires operas, novels, poems, songs. And so why spend £100 on getting a ticket to a production of the opera Tristan and Isolde when you'll be given the experience, the agony, the heart-rending experience for nothing? You'll be invited into one of mankind's greatest stories and its misery. Simply recognizing this distinction between a good life and great stories helps me to distance myself a bit from it, to take a fresh look at what is happening. You see, in my video, I explained that people like James Bond and the other characters that I was rescuing in my written stories, they were wanting some act of magic to lift them out of their great story into a good life. There you are, miserable with unrequited love, going through hell, and the temptation of magic is to find some love potion that will make the adored person fall in love with you and put you back into a good story. That is what people's expectation of magic is, very often. What does it say about our civilization, our psychology, and the realities we're creating? That we should spend almost a quarter of millions of people around the world should spend almost a quarter of their waking life enjoying good stories, reveling in corruption, murder. You remember in the early days of murders, detective stories, Agatha Christie, it would be one murder in the library of a country house, and the whole book would be about the solution of that murder. But in today's series, there's always that point in sort of the first or second episode when the person says, my God, we've got a serial killer on our hands. It's not enough to have one murder anymore. You have to have strings of murders to make a good story. So we spend a large part of our lives reveling in enjoying corruption, violence, warfare, environmental destruction. And we spend the rest of our lives lamenting the fact that they're all around us. What does that say about our psychology and the world we are creating for ourselves? One of the greatest stories is the collapse of civilizations. Great civilizations like, is it the Incas in South, or Aztecs in South America, that flourished and then collapsed. The Roman civilization, Egyptian civilization, China. These great civilizations that rose to something almost perfect and then collapsed. Now, what greater story could there be than that of a species that was intelligent, that mastered its world and then destroyed it and destroyed itself in the process? That would be a space opera that could live on for millions of years throughout the universe. And are we wishing that on ourselves? We need to think about this distinction between a great story and a good life. I suggested in my video that we value truth over beauty and goodness, rather than in the past when goodness, the good, the beautiful and the true were all on an equal footing and they were all closely linked. If we could recognize that the good and the beautiful, in other words, the good life and the beautiful story, need not be in opposition to each other, they should be linked up. And then they could come true. I'm not so much suggesting an answer, I'm suggesting a new way of thinking about this. And that was what the video was really about. Did I blow your mind?